To celebrate the 118th anniversary of Ayn Rand's birth, we wanted to focus on Ayn Rand's distinctively value centered approach to philosophy and to living life. As Ayn Rand's longtime student and, in her final years, close friend, my guest today, Dr. Harry Binswanger, saw firsthand how Ayn Rand integrated passionate valuing and austere reason. Welcome to New Ideal Live, the podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute. My name is Aaron Smith. I'm a fellow at ARI, and joining me today is Dr. Harry Binswanger. Welcome, Harry.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Our topic today is Ayn Rand's distinctively value-centered approach to philosophy and to life. And what is meant by a value-centered approach to philosophy? And what does this have to do with the way Ayn Rand holds philosophy or the way she thinks about philosophy in general?
Her view of philosophy in general is in stark contrast to contemporary academic philosophy. It's in the same tradition as the great philosophers in history. It's a guide to living. It's a guide to life. It's a normative field. That is, it's a field that makes value judgments. And she had she identified two areas in philosophy that were particularly crucial to get guidance in. One is epistemology, the theory of knowledge, to know how you determine what is true. And the other is ethics, the study of good and evil, to know what to do about it when you discover something is true. But one thing that's fairly unique about her is the tight integration of those two. She did not make a dichotomy between fact and value, between truth and goodness. She saw both as a recognition of reality. And one of her great accomplishments, probably her greatest, was her validation of a standard of morality based upon the facts of reality.
And can you say something about why has that been first of all, why is it an achievement, and why has it been historically a problem? Some kind of separation or some kind of a split between fact and values. I seem to remember her saying someplace that issue has sort of like the is ought kind of problem that has sort of wreaked havoc in philosophy and in people's lives. Could you say a bit about that, and then why it's such an achievement to see that this is a false alternative or there's something wrong with it?
Before I came on, I went to ChatGPT and put in, how do you prove normative statements? And I can't read you the full answer, but it said you can't prove them. They are not objective, they are subjective. They are an expression of preferences and vary from individual to individual and culture to culture. Now that's wrong, but that's ChatGPT is the accumulated quote wisdom quote of the web, of the internet. And unfortunately, it mirrors what has been the majority view, or almost the monopoly view, in philosophy and in common living for the last 200 or 300 years, that you can't prove in ethics, that reason has nothing to say about ultimate values. So it was a great achievement because since David Hume, it's been declared absolutely impossible. David Hume claimed to be able to prove that you could not rationally derive an ethics. His proof didn't go through, but that's not widely recognized.
And so where does the rubber meet the road here? Because if it's so there's you can't prove that values are objective, or you can't prove an objective morality. That's inherently subjective. Why does that? Ayn Rand certainly disagrees with that, but why does that push us in a bad direction? What's the harm?
Well, if there's no objective way of deciding between you want to live and I want to kill you, well, like my desire to kill you is good for me because I want it, and your desire to live is good for you because you want it, and just people conflict. take anything you want. Religion, living by Christ's ethics is good, or living by Christ's ethics is evil, just means hurrah for Christ's ethics or boo to Christ's ethics. So it just destroys the whole field. It means
Okay.
that rather than ethics telling you what to do, it says go with your feelings. Whatever you feel like doing, that's all there is. It doesn't really even tell you that. It says nothing. It says it's up to you.
Yeah. So
So it's a
you also have,
destruction of morality.
and you also would have no way then of objectively defending any kind of value or any kind of value approach or one's own life when the chips came down, in effect.
Yeah, it's all, what is the view today? That it's all cultural. Well, I was brought up to think that it's important to do X, to be polite or to give to the poor or whatever it is. I was brought up that way. That's what our culture holds. Other cultures, like the Greek culture, charity is not a particular virtue in the Greek culture. Well, that's just their culture. So cultural relativism is just the extension of individual subjectivism because you can't, they claim, prove an ethics. But Ayn Rand did. You
And so
want me to?
what was her attitude to values then? I mean, what was her approach to why does she think values
Well,
can be objective? Like what would be, yeah.
she asked a deeper question than any preceding uh, thinker on this view. Preceding thinkers, even Aristotle, who's the best, asked, well, what values should men pursue? What should they go after? What kind of life is the good life? And then they looked around at what they could see about different life choices that people have made and tried to pick the best one. She actually began that way too. And then you can see in her notes at a certain point, she says, in effect, wait, the first question is what are values and why does man need them? And that's the question that she raised that no one else had raised. What are values and why does man need them? She found that the concept of value meant that which one acts to gain and or keep as a first cut at what it means, and that concept had certain presuppositions in earlier concepts, such as it presupposes an entity capable of acting. You can't say a stone has values, it can't do anything. It presupposes an entity capable of acting in the face of an alternative. If the results for the entity are the same, there's no value to it for its actions. So, like a volcano blows up, you could look upon that as something it does, but it doesn't face any alternative. It can't be helped or hurt by what happens from that eruption. So she realized that the basic alternative that gives rise to values is the alternative of life or death. It's only to a living organism, she said, that things can be good or evil. So ethics is based upon the fact that you have to do something and you have to do something in a certain way to obtain certain things to stay alive. So that is the fact of reality that gives rise to all the value concepts, good and bad, success and failure, goal achievement, goal frustration, even the psychological concepts like joy and suffering, pleasure and pain, are the stand ins in consciousness for the alternative of survival versus death. Pain is a warning sign you're on the wrong course, you're leading to death. Pleasure is this is good for you. Now it's not, it's only a start because you can't have a built-in mechanism to tell you, oh, buy Microsoft stock when it drops below 100, even if that turns out to be good for you. So there's not a guidance suitable for a rational being in the sensations of pleasure and pain. But I think, she didn't say this, but I think if you were born without the capacity to feel bodily sensations of pleasure and pain, you couldn't develop any values. Nothing would matter to you.
You couldn't
But
orient
you
yourself.
have those sensations as a biological adaptation to surviving. So I can go on, but I should stop and give you a chance to say something.
Yeah. So what you're saying is, someone like Aristotle looked around and found what are the admirable characters, what are the admirable people, and what are their admirable characteristics, and how do we build those into our character and to live a good life? But then you're saying that what Ayn Rand did was ask a deeper question, or a prior question, in effect, is what are values and why do we need them? And that led her on the path to a validation, in effect. Because once you start asking a lot of those kinds of questions and say, yeah, well, what are values? Well, the things that we pursue, we try to hang on to get, to obtain. Why do we need to do any of that? Well, because we face this alternative between life and death, and it really matters whether you
Right.
get this or don't get that. And so it then oriented her to a life based morality versus it's some other world and there are commands, or it's the society has expectations, or it's your glands or your feelings. It's no, it's the requirements of life and what you need to do to obtain them, maintain them, and advance your life. And so it's like so you think that's the factual basis on which you're getting the normative or the guidance that her philosophy is offering, and it certainly would explain why. I mean, she seemed to face. If you watch, I mean, watch her in an interview, watch her in a Q&A, and she takes every issue like there's a life and death significance to it. It matters deeply, and there's a way in which you could tie basically any issue back to the
Right.
issue of it's a pro-life, it's an anti-life, it's harmful, it's helpful, it hurts you, it helps you.
Right. Right. And things that are more human than just barely physical survival are required for a human being to survive. For instance, art. People say, well, I got a question just the other day. How is good art something that fits in with the scheme that life is the premise behind all values? Well, the answer to that, which Ayn Rand discovered, is that art is a necessity of psychological health. And your psychological health is a necessity of your physical survival. People who are terminally depressed do not take the actions that their survival requires. Now, maybe somebody else will keep them alive, but they're not going to go to work and earn a living. They're not going to be prepared to do what's all the things that are required to live life to the fullest. So even things like art, which is at the farthest extremity from food in the mouth, is crucially important because you are a living organism faced with the alternative of life or death. If you weren't, art wouldn't have any particular interest for you. So
And when
everything. Let me just get to the climax. Life is the premise, or death is the premise, and on a morality of life, which is her morality, she says, all that which is proper to the life of a rational being is the good. All that which destroys it is the evil. So the standard of moral judgment, the standard of moral value is the life of man as a rational being. And she has an explanation of why it's that. Why is it qua rational being that we're looking at? But let me not get into that at this moment.
Yeah, and I think it's enormously clarifying to have a standard. It's one thing to have a model, like what would Jesus do, or I don't think it's a good model, but what would Jesus do, or what would Howard Rourke do? It's great to have a model, an image, um, some to kind of look up to. But it's another thing to have a standard, a yardstick that you can refer back to think is because when you ask the question about art, I mean, art is a complicated issue. Exactly how art relates to life and what you get out of art, there's a lot to say about that. But if one is asked that question, like how does art relate to human life, the question, what should go on in the mind is, well, how does it relate to my life? What do I get out of it? Does it bring a value to me? Because it says, well, it should have, if it's good, it should have some bearing on my life. It should bring me pleasure. It should bring me joy. Or maybe I hate it. There's some kind of value response, and there's some sort of relationship to my life. When I used
Right.
to, people used to ask that question about the relation. People, I mean, Ayn Rand thinks that you need art, and a lot of people, that's a strange thing to say. And in part, it might be, and we don't want to get totally into the issue of art, but um, partly because the art doesn't play a big role in people's life. They don't really experience a lot of art. But I think if you start
Well, I
thinking
think
about,
it does. I think music is
yeah,
almost
that,
omnipresent.
yeah, that's what I was going to say. And
That,
you take everything from, if you removed every art form from your life, I think you would be very surprised. Like music, no music. That means not in the car, not in the grocery store, not in your home. No TV, no movies, no, and just really eliminate all forms of artistic work. No representations of man in the world, whether it's acting or it's painting or it's whatever, or the music. And it's just, I think it would be just, you have to. But my point about
and
values is, you'd have to. What would my life be like without that? And that helps key you
yeah,
into the
and
values
it's
again.
more than that, Aaron. It's more than that because the same general principles apply to design that apply to fine art. That it is a pleasure for the human consciousness, qua human consciousness. So you'd have to imagine that the objects, your furniture, your house, the glasses you drink from, the silverware are all completely undesigned and merely utilitarian without any aesthetic dimension. It would be very depressing, particularly if you've experienced the opposite.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that because I have very strong feelings about this and thoughts as well. But it's very common. So this is another general question about values and Ayn Rand's attitude toward them. It's common. I don't know how widespread exactly, but it's common and it's known that people tend to think of material values as stuff. Yeah, you're just accumulating stuff. It's in a sense that it's sort of unspiritual, or and the desire for material values and one's investment, in effect, into material values is kind of demeaned or put down as sort of like materialistic, in the sense in which that's a negative
Mhm.
or it's a bad thing, as opposed to spiritual. How did she? I mean, I think I know the answer to this, but she didn't think about that way. That's
I mean,
materialistic. If you, yeah,
the
there's a
whole of
spiritual
Atlas Shrugged,
dimension. Yeah, there's a
the whole of
spiritual
Atlas
dimension.
Shrugged is against that. The whole of Atlas Shrugged is about material values are the result of spiritual values, and that they help the survival of a being who's both an integration of mind, who's an integration, not both, that's redundant, who's an integration of mind and body. So if you start talking about material values as not values, you've cut man in two, as her hero says in his speech at the end of the novel. You can't sever the material realm from the spiritual realm. And the spiritual here means pertaining to values and consciousness, not supernatural, not religious in any sense, but pertaining to consciousness. So it's matter and consciousness, both exists. You know, she said when she was 16 in Russia, which is where she grew up, someone asked her, are you a materialist who believes everything is matter, or a spiritualist who thinks everything is consciousness? And she said, a materialist, of course. And then she said that she went home and she thought about it, and she said, why do we have to herself, why do we have to choose between them? And she became very firmly sold on the mind body or soul body integration. So it's a spiritual value. And I have one here. I have an Ayn Rand integration here to show you.
Okay.
I hope see this glass?
The glass. Uh-huh.
This this was Ayn Rand's. I have 4 Ayn Rand glasses that are coils of blue green, her favorite color, at the bottom. And this is the glass that we drank iced tea from when I came over to play Scrabble at her place. She used these. This is a material value that, of course, it's artistic, that embodies a spiritual value. So she believed in what she called the stylized universe, which is that you make everything around you reflect your value choices. And she did that. Her apartment, everything that she dealt with, insofar as she had the financial means to do so, was stylized according to her value preferences.
So let's turn. So one more general thing, and then I want to turn to more specific
Mhm.
things about Ayn Rand's choices and values and your relationship with her. Um, there are no black and whites. What was her view about that? Because I think many people who have accepted what you said about that fact value issue, where values are inherently subjective, and I think that there's this perspective that you can't really look at things in terms of black and white anymore, if that's right. And then it also, I think, undercuts people's confidence in their own values because they, well, I mean, I like it, but it's kind of subjective, and they don't have the real force of conviction, I think, when it comes to their values. And it can lead people to not value their
Right.
values, if you want to put it that way. Like, but she definitely had a very black and white perspective. And how does that relate to the fact that values are related to factual issues?
Well, yeah, that's what gives rise to blacks and whites, is that life is white and death is black. It's the ultimate black and white issues, whether you live or die. She would have said, if I could put words into her mouth, there are no blacks and white. Is that black and white? Maybe you should say, well, it's not black and white, but I think to some extent there are no blacks and whites. Well, is that black and white? Is it black and white that it's only to some extent? So there's no way to even state the position that denies the existence of absolutes, because whatever comes out of your mouth is meant as an absolute. And if you qualify it, the qualification is meant as an absolute. I have stories about that, but
The
she
closest you
wrote
could
an
get to is like
article.
the ancient
Yeah.
skeptics who refuse to hold any position, even in their own mind. But that just means shutting down cognition and reducing yourself to the perceptual level of an animal. Uh,
Yeah, I think it was Chrysippus, wasn't it, who stopped talking altogether?
no,
The
that was
cynics walked on
yeah, Cratylus.
Cratylus, yeah.
Yeah,
The cynics were a school, cynic is close to dog in Greek, and they were named
yeah.
that because they were so convinced that you couldn't know anything as a human being that they walked around on all fours and drank water out of mud puddles.
I,
So the
I don't know
Greeks
how
took it
anecdotal that is
seriously.
from from uh, from old accounts and stories, but certainly this certainly that kind of attitude will have effects on one's life. But let me ask you, because you knew Ayn Rand, you met her, you got to um, kind of witness face to face her attitude, like as a human being. And tell me about, like, how did you come to know Ayn Rand, and what was she like as a person? I mean, in the context of this kind of value approach, what impacted you when you met her?
I first saw her give a lecture at MIT when I was a freshman. Uh, and what she said for the first half of the talk, I didn't get it at all. But then she got to the statement about free will that I thought was staggeringly important, the most important thing I'd ever heard in my life. And I started paying attention. And then in the question period, she was black and white. For instance, she was asked, what is, this was a topic in the 60s, which is when we're talking, what is the objectivist sexual ethics? Now, this was a period when Playboy was just getting big and the sexual revolution was starting because the pill had just been mass marketed. So, for the first time, women could have sex with a sort of carefree attitude. And she began her answer by saying, we're very chaste. And then she went on to say that that's because we think sex is, we being objectivists, think that sex is a huge value and is not to be taken lightly. And so promiscuity is inappropriate. But when she said, we're very chaste, I thought, wow, no one else would say that. That's so black and white. That's so counter. Everybody else would say, if they were religious, they would say sex is okay within the bounds of marriage or something. But anybody else would say, well, people can't get hung up about sex. You can't be puritanical. This was the educated person's view. Freud has shown us that we're all low sexual desiring beings, and let's not play games. Let's not rationalize. It's a physical pleasure with no meaning. It's like sport, and it's no big deal. And what I heard when she's, we're very chaste, is she takes herself seriously, and nobody else did. So that made a big impression on me. But it wasn't. I went out and read Atlas Shrugged because she quoted from the hero of Atlas Shrugged in her talk. She said, as John Galt says in Atlas Shrugged, and I thought, wow, that takes a lot of chutzpah. Everybody else would say, as Baudelaire once wrote, as C.I. Lewis once said, or C.S., there are two of them, as Ezra Pound once wrote, but she quoted from herself. I thought that takes a lot of nerve. So I had to read this book, Atlas Shrugged. And once I got more than 60 pages into that, I was hooked. So I reshaped my life to be an objectivist philosopher. And of course, that meant coming to New York, but it also meant going to lectures in Boston on her philosophy, which came out of the New York headquarters. And the representative, the one who held those lectures, knew Ayn Rand, and she introduced me to her. But it was inevitable that I would eventually get to know her to some extent. The only question was, would she accept me? And eventually she did. She didn't accept me right away, but eventually I proved myself over time. So I knew her very well. What was she like? To quote one of her own statements in one of the plays, like nothing you bastards ever dreamed of. A friend of mine who was at Columbia Law School got to spend a couple of hours with her, and he said she thinks every minute of her life is important. And that's what she radiated, this intensity, this both seriousness and playfulness at times, but a value orientation. She wanted to know. She wanted to discuss ideas. She wanted to hear what you thought and to dialogue with you and find out if she could improve her own view or improve your view. So she was a dynamo. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been in the presence of anyone with real charisma, but she had charisma on steroids. You felt when you were in her presence that there was some solar flare that had come out. I mean, maybe I'm going too far, but I just want to
But she was kind
stress
of
it was
magnetic.
an experience. It was an experience being around her and talking to her.
When you said that, or your friend said that she treats like every moment of her life as important, that's to me that speaks to a profound self-esteem, and it's in the relationship of that to there's something in relationship of that to your value orientation, because part of wanting values is wanting values for yourself, and wanting to be happy, wanting to enrich one's life, thinking of oneself as deserving of them. And so there's a deep connection, I think, between self-esteem and that value orientation. Because I think people less self-esteem, less self-confident, less they also tend to be less ambitious in terms of their personal goals, less more like it's my life, damn it, and I want it, I deserve it. It's and that connection between there is important. She seemed to have both intensely.
Yeah, I don't think you can have self esteem if you have confidence in something that you don't care about. For instance, in your ability in something. I knew a philosopher, no, I knew a philosopher who told me about another philosopher who spent his life on Plotinus, who was a
Mhm.
Neoplatonist in about 2 or 300 AD. Rather obscure, but a transmission belt of Platonism into Christianity, so of some importance. And my friend, the philosopher, asked this Plotinus scholar, "Do you like Plotinus?" He said, "No." So here's a guy who spent his whole life's work on explaining the thought of somebody he didn't care for. Now, I don't think you can have much self esteem if you devote yourself dutifully to something that you don't love. You have to, self esteem is the conviction, she says, of being able to live and worthy of living. And life is value achievement. So if you're able to keep eating and maybe not so worthy, nothing to establish your worth, how can you have real self esteem? You
Yeah,
can't.
I think the
So
issue
you're
about
right. I
Plotinus is like
agree with
it's
you.
a job.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's a
She
job.
wrote
I'm,
on the,
I'm smart. I can write papers on this kind of thing, and
yeah,
I could pick Plotinus or I could pick Heraclitus. It doesn't really matter.
right. And there were philosophers. Well, here's an experience I had that's in that direction. I once talked to a flutist that played with the Los Angeles Symphony Philharmonic Orchestra. And she said that most of the people, maybe 90% of the people in the orchestra, regarded it as a job. They weren't passionate about the music. They weren't trying to stretch themselves to do better and to interpret it more interestingly. They were just putting in time to get a paycheck. That completely floored me. You would think, a successful musician must love his field, but she
Yeah,
said no.
I had the exact same experience. When I did my PhD at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and I met a guy who was on, I think, the board of the orchestra, the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra. He invited me over to his place because they were having a reception. The orchestra members were there, and shrimp on a big thing of ice, and it was a nice, very nice place. And I started chatting. I'm a bit passionate about classical music, and I've read all sorts of like biographies of composers, performers. I'm just totally into it, and I've read like 10,000 million liner notes from classical music CDs.
Mhm.
I'm a just sponge about this stuff, and I started talking to them about. We were just chatting about music, and I was surprised they had the same attitude. It was they didn't seem to know much about music. They didn't seem to know much about. I mean, they know how to play and they know how to like read music. I don't read
Yeah.
music. I don't even play an instrument, but they just had no wider, very little extension between what they were required for their work, and they very the people I talked to were just not passionate about music. And we were talking about
I'll give you,
recordings of favorite recordings of pieces, and they're
yeah,
like, I don't know, it's just that just stunned me. Like, how can you, especially in a field like that? But I get it. I mean, you could take it. It's a job. I can do it. I'm competent at it. But there's something
yeah,
about. But don't you want to live?
exactly. A former girlfriend's father had come out of World War II and had gotten into the dry cleaning business. I brought him a suit to dry clean, and it came back somehow looking better than it had on the rack when I bought it. And his shop did not have that dry cleaner's smell. And he eventually showed, starting from nothing, he eventually got to sell it for $1 million. So I once asked him, how come your dry cleaning operation is so much better than every other one I've seen? And he said, I try.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
They
It's
don't
that
try,
it's
they're
that
just putting
investment.
in
It's that you
motion.
care, and there's some relation to your self-respect and to your self-esteem, and that because it's a good job, because I did a good job, and because I do a good job, and that's that relationship between self-esteem, self-respect, and investment in something, um, that you care because it's you.
Absolutely. I
So you
agree.
good.
No, I'm done with that topic.
Yeah. So you had said once that Ayn Rand lived and breathed applied philosophy. That it wasn't sort
Yeah,
of something you go to your office and you do some philosophy, or you give a lecture or something, and then you just go back to living. But that somehow that some kind of a philosophical perspective was always sort of at play, or sort of in the background's not the right word, but integrated into the way in which
yeah.
she
In the
faced things.
foreground with her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I'll give you some examples. One one time I was in her apartment, and she had cats. Cats were a big value of hers, and a cat had knocked over something or scratched up something, and the cat was there on the floor. And I looked down and I said, "Bad cat." And she said, "No, good cat who took a bad action." That was the first time I'd heard the distinction that she made between judging the entity, the person or the animal, and judging an action. So it's possible for a good person to take a bad action, and one shouldn't be afraid. She didn't say this, but thinking about it, some of the fear that people have of moral judgment, some of it is due to the fact that they think if anything they did was immoral, then they're damned to hell. She didn't have that perspective at all. She wanted everything to be judged because everything that you did was pro life or anti life. But it didn't mean if you were late for an appointment because you were not paying attention, that means you're going to objective as hell, which there is none, evidently, or you're going to die. So the Christian morality or pseudo morality has made people fear morality, when in fact it's just your guide to living. That's what it is. Uh, the other one is a story I don't know firsthand, but I was told that Ayn Rand was in a restroom somewhere at a restaurant or whatever, and they had the stalls that they used to have in the old days where you had to put in a quarter to use the toilet in the restaurant. Probably not in a restaurant, in a department building they would do
Mhm.
that. And a woman was coming out of the stall and tried to hold the door open for Ayn Rand so she wouldn't have
Wouldn't
to
have to
pay the
pay.
quarter. Yeah. And she said, reportedly, if I were going to sell my soul, do you think I would sell it that cheaply?
So she took this as
That's,
like, this is
yeah.
the terms here are that you pay a quarter for it, and that's the terms. And I'm not going to try to cheat it. And because most people would think, but it's, come on, it's a quarter. It's not a big deal. And this doesn't count in effect. And I
And
bet her
this
view was
doesn't
everything
count.
counts. Yeah.
Everything counts. I once asked her, isn't every choice a moral choice? And she said yes. Because in the objectivist morality, this is me filling it in, this is why I said it, and it's obvious. Everything you do either helps you or hurts you. Maybe a little bit, maybe a lot. And you often can't tell. So you can not focus on something that you should have focused on, and it may not have any really big consequences. But sometimes it will. It will have really big, because you didn't focus on it. You didn't realize, oh my God, if I paid attention to that, I would be much better off. So, again, remember, we're not talking about dying tomorrow. We're talking about being on the road to life, living life to the fullest, living consistently, or mixing in some poison with it. There's never any justification for that.
So it's like micro dosing on poison, where it's just
Yeah,
there's all
well, you
little
can
bits
do
of
that.
things, small little bits of things that are not on the path to life and the good and to self-esteem and self-respect, and in some way, however small. And she's, I don't want to put my foot on that path at all. And not because there's some sort of, there's a punisher out there somewhere that's going to, like, you stepped over the line and you're going to get judged and punished, but because it harms your own life and your own ability to pursue values and maintain self-respect. I mean, that's like sort of difference
Oh, that
between, you said Christianity's made it seem like morality is your enemy because you're always worrying about, like, what if I can't step over the line, I'm going to get judged. It's about avoiding punishment and the fear of punishment versus the prospect of values and happiness and joy and success and life that's always should be, I think, in the forefront. And if it's sort of if there's something you do that's wrong, it's like the idea is to correct it, not like, oh my God, somebody could judge me.
right. You're going to judge yourself, but it's not about anybody else's judgment. You're going to judge
No
yourself
one will
because you
know. It's
know,
only in my mind. It's
yeah,
that kind
no
of thing.
one
But
will
yeah, it's
know
in your mind.
except me. And what importance am I? Yeah. Uh,
Yeah.
I wanted to bring up, and you keyed it in my memory. I wanted to bring up that today is Ayn Rand's birthday, and I have created Rand's Day, which is a special holiday to celebrate her birthday. This is my own creation and project. And on Rand's Day, you give yourself a present. And on my website, randsday.com, which I urge you to go to, I give a quote from the Fountainhead, which is revealing and what keyed off the memory. Peter Keating, one of the villains or non-admirable characters, says too late in his life, why do they say it's easy to do what you want? It's the hardest thing in the world to do what you really want, not some momentary urge or something. And he sold his soul. He destroyed himself by not doing what he wanted, but doing what his mother wanted and his boss wanted and other people wanted. So that is a very important theme in objectivism, is that you need to do what you really seriously, after reflection, choose to pursue, that you want, that you need to make your life meaningful to you. Don't settle for anything less.
And that's a deep point. It's, first of all, it's a very, very moving scene in the book because you've watched the arc of this guy's life,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and you watch also what that character gives up in that book, and it's heart wrenching actually. But it's a deep point, and it's easy to sort of, maybe because people often say, like, just like the character does, people say it's easy to do what you want, right? Because that's, oh, selfishness. Oh, come on, you're just telling people to just, do what you want, and the way in which they regard that is easy, which I think in the end isn't easy, but is go with the flow, do what you feel like, as opposed to think carefully about what you really want in your life, what you want your life to shape up to be, what you want your character to shape up to be, what kind of life you want to lead, a life you could admire, to look up to, love like crazy. What does that look like? What do you want? And you have to really think about that across the course of a life, and then actively go pursue it. Have the courage to pursue it against often opposition, fear, sometimes lack of confidence. There's just a lot to do, and it's so hard to do what you really really want to do. And I think that's a really deep point, and because it's, I think, unfortunately, sadly, for all sorts of reasons, that people don't do it, or not people, not everybody, but it's. I often feel that it's an uncommon thing to really, really go after what you really want, and to really
Yes.
pursue it,
Okay.
and then to reap the rewards. And that's what life is about. I mean, that's where life is, at its best. And I think Ayn Rand certainly understood that. I remember, was there? There was a story. I don't remember whether this was in uh, My 30 Years with Ayn Rand. The essay by Dr. Peikoff, but where she was on the steps of the publisher after publishing Atlas Shrugged, and somebody, maybe it was him, I don't remember, asked, "Was it worth it?" And she said yes, or something like that. I mean, all the struggle that she had to go through. Probably getting that anecdote wrong, but yeah.
You've got the essence right, but it's even better because they were looking in the window of a bookstore that was just put out Atlas Shrugged in the window of the bookstore, and she volunteered. It's worth it. So no one asked her, was it worth she that was
Okay.
her perspective. It was worth it. It was a lot of struggle and suffering in writing Atlas, particularly Galt's speech, which took her 2 years, but it was worth it. And after it was published, she often picked it up and just read it for sheer pleasure and delight, uh, preening in what she had done and loving it.
That's something else that came out in I think it was a Phil Donahue episode, when she said, "Ayn Rand, you are something." And she says, "I think so." And he started moving on to his next prepared question. And he's like, "Well," he's like, hang on, that's a hell of a thing to say. Like, what? So you're okay with just saying something like that? It's like, and she says, "Yeah, it's okay if you've done something and you've really achieved something. It's okay to know it and to be proud of it, and to, in effect, show to other people that you're proud of it. It's sort of, there are things to achieve, and there's the part of the reward is I'm happy about myself. It doesn't mean you go around as a braggart, but it's sort of like, no, I did it, and I thought you think I'm special for it. I like that. Also,
Right.
something just people don't
Well, most people aren't anything.
say.
Um, yeah, she knew who she was, and yet, before she established herself in the 30s, when she was still an unknown, even though she published We the Living, which was not a big success because the type was broken after 3,000 copies had sold out because the publisher thought it wouldn't sell, but it would have, as it has since then. She wrote to Frank Lloyd Wright, and she wrote the most humble, if I can use a word that doesn't apply, most respectful, non assuming letter to Frank Lloyd Wright asking if he would read some of her, I think it was would he read parts of The Fountainhead that she had written, she had just starting, or that she wanted to meet him. So she was very objective about it. She didn't expect other people to take her on faith. She thought she had to demonstrate her value, particularly to someone that she admired, who had proved he was an achiever like Wright was. Later, incidentally, in life, she became very disillusioned about Wright as a person. She always loved his architecture, but she found that as a person, he was not independent outside of the studio. In his private life, he was a second hander.
Hmm. Let me ask you. Let me turn to a
She did
few.
meet him.
Uh,
She did go to Taliesin and that whole scene there, and she was not favorably impressed by that.
Interesting. It's interesting because she, it's part of the issue of objectivity, and partly the issue is people are whole people. They're not just their work; they're their character and their person, and she could separate the two.
Yeah.
Let me ask.
There was another one. I had another story, but it just flitted out of my 78-year-old brain.
That's okay. I just turned 50, so I'll ask you a question. Uh,
Oh, I know what it
so
is now. I know it. Can I slip it in?
flip it in.
It's about the valuing psychology. The pretext for my going to visit her in the last couple of years of her life was to play Scrabble. She liked Scrabble, and I liked Scrabble. And it was Leonard Peikoff who suggested that I arrange to do that with her. And you might wonder, those of you who realize Ayn Rand's incredible genius, what kind of Scrabble player was she? Well, she was good, but no great shakes. I mean, nothing to gasp over. She was on the same level I was. Why is that? Because Scrabble was not a huge value. It was a pleasant, entertaining, relaxing thing to do at the end of the day sometimes. It was a game. So she did not approach it the way she approached the things that were her values. It was a minor value, so she did it and she was good at it. But her whole brain was organized around writing fiction and writing philosophy. I'll give you one final example. Once she was at my apartment looking out at, I lived in Manhattan where she lived at that time, and we were looking out in the evening at other buildings nearby, and she kind of half whispers, "The lighted squares hanging in space," which was a phrase that she had used in one of her novels, The Lighted Windows. She called the lighted squares hanging in space. And she couldn't, that was what was coming up from her subconscious. Now, if you devoted your life to Scrabble, as some people do, you see a sign and you immediately start thinking of anagrams of that. So, what your subconscious is organized around is a matter of what your interests, your values, your goals are. And it's mutually reinforcing. It's a virtuous cycle, not a vicious cycle. The more you value something, the more your subconscious gloms on to what's relevant to that. The more your subconscious gloms on to information relevant, the more you can achieve your values.
You know, you, I, that's an important point, and you mentioned you said this once in a lecture you gave. I don't know when I heard this. I heard it on cassette tape. I don't know when, but you said it's a way of holding that point. You said values are the motor of cognition, and I've always remembered that phrase, and I've always held it. It helps me hold that whole perspective. Is that it's just why think about anything? And
Yeah,
it has to do with that sort of it's what's your interest isn't just like there's the realm of values and then there's the realm of cognition and there's a how do they ever meet? It's one fuels the other, and it's
I think
yeah.
they're so connected that I would put not her, would put the alternative of life or death as a hierarchical point that comes before epistemology. Because I don't think that a being that had no values, no goals, could actually pursue any cognitive activity. It wouldn't know anything, it wouldn't take in anything. I think that consciousness is to guide action, action is to get things to use for your life, for your survival. So if you didn't have that, I don't think you'd care what you saw, or you wouldn't think about. I don't mean you, I mean a being, an imaginary being.
So we have a few minutes left before the sort of closing remarks and so on. Can you tell me, since it's about Ayn Rand's values, value orientation, can you tell me about some of her favorites, some of the things that she was really passionate about, some of the things that she loved, whether, however, they're grand scale or they're smaller scale,
Yeah.
from what you know about her?
Well, as I said, is she had design choices. She loved modern furniture, modern architecture. Like in Frank Lloyd Wright, she loved the color blue green, and those are the kind of minor but personal values. And she loved cats; they were a major value. She said, one can either have cats or have unscratched furniture. I choose to have cats. And she loved her Tiddlywinks music, which was a special kind of turn of the century from the
The other
1800s
century.
to the 1900s, that century, gay kind of music. Scott Joplin is something that would qualify, I believe, and that people are familiar with. But she loved her husband so much that when he died, she didn't want to do anything. She, the great agent and value pursuer and so on, that's why I went to play Scrabble with her, because she wasn't doing anything. She said she lost her top value, and she found it hard to find a reason to go on. Then she discovered a certain actor while watching TV that embodied her style, her attitude, her idea of what a man should be. And she said it was like the sun came out again. She sprung into action. She started writing a teleplay, screenplay for TV of Atlas Shrugged. She decided to produce it herself and to get this actor to play the role of Francisco. She said it was particularly when she connected in her mind this actor with the role of Francisco that life returned to her. If not to keep it a mystery, his name is Hans Gudegast, but he changed that, and you may know him as Eric Braeden, who's on a soap opera, The Young and the Restless, I think it is, and he plays a villain on that, and he's no longer, obviously at this age, the dashing figure that he was in the series that we watch together weekly, or sometimes it was on more than weekly, The Rat Patrol, which is a pretty good
Oh
series and
yeah,
I
I remember that
recommend
as a
most.
kid. My dad and I used to watch
Christopher
that, sitting in the
Joy,
basement on the couch. The Rat Patrol. I forgot about that.
The Rat Patrol, and she had in effect a crush on Hans Gudekast, who played Captain Hans Dietrich, the enemy, the German Wehrmacht, not Nazi. She couldn't have adopted him as a character in any sense, but it was in the German army, and he always got defeated by the American good guys, which is proper. But he had that Francisco-ish elan, uh, panache that
Hmm.
almost no one has. So I recommend that to your audience.
That's great. I actually didn't know about that. And who can't fall in love with? Who can't have a crush on Francisco? But that's interesting too, because she what seemed to inspire her is always like looking up, finding something that's
Yes,
admirable, finding something that's, I mean, she thought of herself as a man worshiper, and not mean male worshiper, but it's just sort of like to look up to the highest. And that's what, I mean, that's why I want to be a writer, right? She wants to, like, she finds these heroic characters, and she's like, I want to write about these people. I want to live in that atmosphere. I want to create that that world and project that the highest possible, and to just devote oneself to the highest possible, both in oneself and in one's art.
that's exactly it. That's exactly her motor, was to create in her writing the ideal man, which she hoped to find in reality. And she found it in Frank O'Connor, her husband, who, you may realize, she denied this to me, but I think it's true nonetheless. Frank O'Connor, Francisco de Anconia. Coincidence? I don't think so. She said she did not, I do not engage in private symbolism, she said. Okay, but maybe I didn't say this to her. Maybe the reason you like the sound of that name is that it's close to Frank's name.
Some kind of subconscious thing.
Yeah. Although she had a hero named Francesco before she ever met Frank. It was Italian, it was
Interesting.
Francesco, but Francisco is
Right.
the Spanish version of it.
Okay. Well, Harry, I wanted to thank you for spending the time with us and sharing these things with it. I always love to hear. I've heard some of your stories, and many I haven't, and so it's always a pleasure to talk about these things. I think, it's kind of a birthday episode, and it's kind of, in a way, it talks about some things that are lighter, but it's such a deep and heavy, weighty issue, the issue of your life, and the issue of valuing and filling your life with values, that it's at the same time, I think, a kind of light and joyous, and also deep and important in life, and that those two aspects of it shouldn't be sundered. And I hope we've conveyed some of that today. So I want to thank our super chatters, if I can coin a word, for your kind donations to the program. I wanted to share some resources if you're interested in a bit more about Ayn Rand as a person and what it was like to know her. So there's Dr. Leonard Peikoff's essay, My 30 Years with Ayn Rand. And also there's a book of recollections by Charles and Marianne Souris called Facets of Ayn Rand. Basically like interview material from two people who knew Ayn Rand closely and were her friends. I want to say a few things about next week's episode of New Idea Live. So we've got Alon Journo and Sam Weaver. They're going to be discussing Natalie Wexler's book. It's called The Knowledge Gap. And the book makes the case that many American schools have abandoned the responsibility of teaching substantive content. So they're going to be discussing some elements from that book. So as always, please send us your questions for future Q&A episodes, so we do take a look at those. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe to the channel on YouTube and click the bell to get notifications when we go live or post new recordings. If you're watching on Facebook, please do the same. Consider clicking like or leaving a comment. It helps us sort of grow the channel. If you have questions or comments about today's episode, you can always email us at newideal@aynrand.org. We read all of your emails and we reply to many of them. So send us what you've got. Again, so thank you very much, Harry. I appreciate that, your time.
Thank
All
you.
right. Bye-bye, everyone.